had quite a few questions now about bias cut on my tutorials, so I thought it was about time I did a specific video that just goes through all the things you need to think about and what you need to do when you are working with bias cut. I'm Ali and I've been dressmaking for over 30 years, since the early 90s. I make all my own clothes, but I've been doing it professionally too for a very long time, including making a lot of wedding dresses, working with silks, chiffons, all of those kind of fabrics. So I'm quite used to working with bias cut. So it doesn't have to be for anything as formal as that. You could use a lightweight linen or cotton for an everyday dress that is bias cut, but the rules are the same for how to work with it. So rule number one that I would definitely say, this isn't for an absolute beginner. It's a lot harder to cut and sew and think about what you're doing with bias cut, particularly for edgings, trims, all of those kind of things. So definitely, if you've never made anything before, I really wouldn't recommend doing bias cut as your first project. But if you are used to sewing and you've made a couple of things before, then there's no reason to not give this a go. So this is a beautiful silk crepe. It drapes really well. If it's your first bias cut project, you might not want to use something like this. Something like a cotton or linen is going to be a little bit easier to work with because it's not so slinky. It doesn't stretch and move quite as much. But if you're making an evening dress or something formal, then this kind of fabric works really well. If you're using a natural fibre like a silk, it's going to drape beautifully and the seams are going to mould really well when you steam them. If you don't want to go to that expense and you want something that's more washable, then you can use a synthetic like a polyester, and it might be a little bit more slippery and the seams won't mould quite so well, but it is still going to drape and stretch around the body just as beautifully as this. So what does bias cut actually mean? It is simply the diagonal, the 45-degree diagonal on your fabric. So as it comes off of the roll, if you imagine the weaving loom, you've got the warp, which is what goes down the length of the weaving loom when it's threaded up, and the weft is what weaves across to make your woven fabric. The bit that goes diagonally is the bias. So you can imagine, unless you've got lycra, you are not going to have any stretch going down lengthways where the loom is or going widthwise, but on that diagonal, that's how you get your stretch. So a bias cut garment is not made out of a knitted fabric. You can't use a jersey or anything like that. It has to be woven because the whole point is it's the natural stretch from how it's woven. So if I show you some fabric, and then I'm going to take this off here and show you how it goes on the mannequin, you'll see exactly what I mean. So this is a 100% silk crepe back satin. So you can see just by how it is off the roll that it hangs really nicely. So what I was trying to explain, hopefully it made sense when it's on the loom, is this is the edge, this is the selvage. So this is the warp going down this direction, and this is the weft as it is woven. So this is also a satin weave. So the bias, which is across diagonally, is going to stretch very slightly different just because of the nature of the weave. So that's another thing you need to think about. If you've got a plain weave fabric, it's going to stretch pretty much the same going in both directions. If you have a satin weave or something like that, it could stretch slightly different. So that's just one more thing to take into account. So I don't want to cut into that lovely big roll of fabric, but I've got an offcut here of some silk crepe, just like what I had on the mannequin a minute ago. So I'm going to show you exactly what I need. It's a little bit crumpled, but please bear with me. So I'm going to bring this over here as I don't want to be standing in front of it. So that is the selvage edge. So basically, if we didn't have it on the bias and I wrap it around my mannequin, you can see it molds quite well because it's such a lovely drapey fabric, but it doesn't mold perfectly in at the waist and it's pulled tight across the bust. So if I do exactly the same thing, but I hold it diagonally, so I'm not going to cut it because then you can see exactly what I mean. I'm just going to put a couple of pins in so I don't drop it. I need lots of hands to do this. So if I now pull that around like that, I don't know how well it shows up in the video, but it's basically not pulling so tight across the bust anymore. And it's also pulling in at the waist. So hopefully you can see the difference in the video just by putting that at the angle, how much better fitted that is. And that means you don't have to have loads of darts. If you weren't cutting it on the bias, you'd be needing either a bust seam going over here, or you'd have a dart at the side and down here. By putting it on the bias, you don't need as much shaping. So I would recommend still having a little bust seam at the side here, but it can just be really short and quite narrow, and you don't need anything here at all. It's going to mould perfectly into the waist. And then you can either just have it continuing all the way down to the hem of the dress, or you could put a seam here and have a separate piece. That's all part of thinking about the design when you come to do it. So what are the pros and cons of using bias cut? Well, certainly the first con that I would say is it's not the easiest thing to work with. You do need to have a little bit of experience of making clothes and sewing, because it's not going to be an easy first project. You're cutting everything diagonally where there's some natural stretch, you're sewing the seams like this. It's not going to be as easy as just using a basic straight cut fabric. But why would you use it? What are the pros of using a bias cut fabric? So as you saw from my roller fabric and by putting it on the mannequin, it's got great stretch. With wovens, unless they have lycra in, they don't stretch, so you can't use them to mould to your body and things like that. But by putting it on the bias, it stretches across your body, so you don't have to have as much shaping. You don't need to have as many darts. If you're having something going over the bust, you want it to go in at the waist, you don't need as many seams. So it's great for doing things like that. And it also drapes beautifully. So if you've got a long, elegant skirt, if you have it bias cut, it's gonna curve around your hips and then it's just gonna hang down and it will look beautiful. So it's definitely better for that. So that's kind of why you would use it. It's the stretch, it's the drape, and it's the elegance of it. However, there are several cons. It uses a lot more fabric. You're cutting all your pieces out diagonally on your fabric rather than along the straight of grain going down. So you do tend to get through more fabric. If you've got something where you've got a separate bodice and there's smaller pieces, you can try and kind of cut those around the bigger pieces for the skirt, but it does definitely create a lot more waste. However, you can always plan in other projects that you're going to use those smaller pieces for, and they come in handy too for trims, bias binding, all of those kind of things. So that's the kind of most obvious con, after obviously being a bit more tricky to work with. So it's less predictable. You can plan everything ahead when it comes to making the pattern, cutting it out, sewing it, all of that. But until you've actually done it, you're not going to see exactly what happens with this. You can play around with little pieces and stretch them over yourself to see how well they drape and how well they stretch. But until you see the big piece, you're not going to know exactly what you've got. And the real point where you notice this is the hem. So you never want to hem something straight away, because over time it's going to stretch downwards. You're going to have stretch going this way, but it's also going to stretch lengthwise. So when you're making something, just leave it to hang, I'd say, for a couple of days before you do the hem. And you're going to have to pin that on yourself. You can imagine if your grain line is going diagonally, it's going to stretch differently at the different points of your hem. It depends how full it is. If it's very full, you could have it hanging down on one side quite a bit more than the other side. So you need to put it on. If you've got someone to help you, that always helps. I wouldn't suggest doing it on a mannequin or on a hanger, because unless you've got your body in it, it's not going to stretch the same. How it hangs over your hips and your legs is going to dictate how that hem falls. So that's definitely the trickiest part of it. But it's just a case of you have to stand in the mirror and kind of look at it, go down, pin it, get back up. But I won't lie, it's not the easiest thing to do on yourself, but it's worth it because it will look fantastic. So when would you want to use it? I would suggest when you've got that bit of experience, but also when you have plenty of time to play around with it. You want to get enough fabric so that you're not scrimping on cutting it out, because you don't want to lay your pieces on and not have them on that true bias, which is the 45-degree angle. You don't want to have to kind of angle them slightly just to get it all out. So make sure you have enough fabric, but really make sure you have enough time. You need to do some practice runs on edgings for necks, armholes, things like that. If you're putting sleeves in it, then that's going to be quite tricky as well. You want plenty of time to be able to tack things first and then sew them. You need plenty of time for pressing as you go, and you really need to take your time with that. I will come on to that in a second. But it's just not something you can rush. If you rush it, you're going to end up stretching it out as you make it. You're not going to get the fit right. It's just not worth rushing. So let's go on to now what things to consider when you're designing something that's bias cut. So I've already talked about the stretch and the drape. So what you make is going to drape really well, it's going to stretch around your body very well, so you don't need loads of darts and seams. So this isn't bias cut that I'm wearing, and I've got seams so it fits around my body, but if I had the same kind of design in bias cut, I wouldn't need anywhere near as many seams. So that is one of the great things, is that you don't need to do loads of paneling, and in fact I would avoid it because sewing the seams on the bias are sometimes a little bit bumpier. However good you are, they are going to stretch and distort. Using natural fabrics always helps. Linen, cotton and silk are great for bias cut because you can steam things to look great as well. But you definitely want to be designing something, at least for a first project, that has as little shaping as you can get away with. So I'd suggest, as I said earlier, having a little dart on the side of the bust here, because to have no darting at all, it's not going to be the easiest thing to fit. But you don't want to be putting darts here, you don't want to be putting princess seams in, you just want the fabric to work with your body to fit nicely. So that's the first thing I think about the design. But what you can do, which is great, is you can really play around with the bias. So if you've got a stripe or a check or something, that's obviously going to be really visible. You can play around with how the lines go on the body, you can have it cut in different directions. If you're having a skirt, for example, that's a lot wider at the bottom than at the top, you can really think about how the pattern works with that, whether it's a print or a stripe or a check. You can work that into your design. But another thing you can do, and you might have noticed this if you've got a dress or a skirt that's really full at the bottom and is bias cut, you'll get a little seam that runs diagonally. And that's because the fabric, generally, that's about as wide as it gets, about 1.5 meters. And if your panel is wider than that, you can't get it all out of one piece. So what you do is you sew an extra bit on the side, and that runs with the edge of the fabric, so the selvage edge. But you can play around with this. You can actually have a diagonal seam going all the way through your skirt, which is on the straight of grain. So that seam is going to be incredibly neat. It's not sewn on the bias, it's cut on the straight of grain, but it appears diagonally on the body. So that's just something really nice you can think about when coming up with your design. You could add plenty of panels like that, really play around with it without having to worry about the quality of the seams. And you could in fact make a dress which is just a complete tube. You could just have a series of diagonal seams and your dress could skim your body, beautifully bias cut, but with these blocks on. I always think at Christmas I want to make one like this in red and white to look like a candy cane. Definitely a project for me this Christmas. So that's kind of one of the really lovely things with bias cut. You can play around in the mirror and see where you want these lines, but think about where your seams are. You don't just have to have your seams going down the sides like you normally would. You could actually make something with no side seam where everything is just diagonal, and then you don't even have to sew on the bias at all. So when you're designing, think about those seams, think about getting rid of darts where you don't necessarily need them, but you also need to think about openings. So if I was making something like this kind of shape with a V and with these armholes, if this was bias cut, these bits are likely to really stretch out. So you can stabilise them with some stay stitching while you're doing it, but you might just want to think about what kind of design works best with bias cut. So just think about necklines. Quite often you see bias cut things where they don't have grown on straps like this. I think that's the best way to word it, but you could have like a bias trim and then a separate strap, and that would work really well. Doesn't mean you can't do something like this, it just means you've got to be really careful with stretching. You need to make sure it's absolutely perfectly on the bias, or you're going to end up with one strap with a little bit more give than the other. And you also need to think about the seams on the shoulders. If you cut them straight like this, they're going to be sewn on that 45-degree angle and they could stretch or pucker. But the same as what I was saying about the side seams, if you want to have a strap like this that's grown on, there's nothing stopping you doing your shoulder seam on the straight of grain. So it could either go this way or this way on the front or back, or you could angle it however you choose to do it, but make it a design feature. Think about how you're cutting it out and where you want to sew the seams, and rather than forcing your fabric to do something it doesn't want to do, just work with it. So a very crude diagram, but if you imagine this is your front piece and this is your back piece, and this is your shoulder here. Normally it's going to be just off from the straight of grain because it's not going straight across, but it's not particularly angled. So if you're doing this bias cut, you're going to be cutting that pretty much on the bias, and that seam is going to be sewn on the bias. But if you rethink about this seam, what you can do, hopefully I can rub this out, is when you're designing, why not think about having that seam at an angle? You can either have it going that way or the opposite way, and you're going to be cutting it more on the straight of grain. It all depends on the shape of your actual pieces, but playing around with that angle could mean that you're sewing on the straight of grain rather than on the bias, and it could be easier and it could prevent it stretching and looking a bit messy. So as many seams as you can get to go on the diagonal on your body, it means they're going on the straight when you're sewing them, and it makes your sewing life easier, but it also opens up the scope for funky designs that you couldn't do with something that's on the straight of grain. While you're thinking about that, you also need to think about how you're going to get it on and off. So if it's a simple slip dress or camisole top, that kind of thing, you should be able to have enough give in it just to go over your head, unless you want it really tight on the waist. And the same with skirts, you need to think about getting it over your hips, and you're going to have a little bit of give on the waist, but probably not enough to get it over your hips unless you have some kind of opening. So what I would suggest is not putting them at the centre back because they're just more in view. If you put it at the side, it's just that little bit more discreet. And because you've got a lot more stretch in the bias than you would in another fabric, you don't need your zip to go all the way to the top, and you don't need it to go all the way to the hip. You can quite often get away with just a short zip that goes just kind of a little bit up and down from where the waist point is, and it just gives you that little bit more movement. So that zip, especially if you sew in a concealed zip, is going to be pretty discreet. Just make sure you reinforce the seams when you sew it, because you don't want to stretch it. You'll end up with a zip that kind of wiggles at the side, which won't look great. But tack it in first, stabilize the seams, and it won't be a problem. If it doesn't look right, just unpick it and do it again. So that's what to consider when you're designing. So now we need to think about the pattern. So what I would suggest is just making your pattern in exactly the same way as you normally would out of a regular woven fabric that's not cut on the bias to start with. I wouldn't work from a jersey pattern, even though it has stretch, because it's just a different kind of design to what you're using with these bias cut. So I would make your pattern, and then when you look at it, you can take a little bit of the width out of the hips and the bust because you've got that natural stretch. And I would just think about the darts that are going through the waist. I would probably get rid of them completely, and then you could always fit it on and bring it in a little bit on the sides, but I would keep a little dart here, because if not, you're going to struggle to get it to fit absolutely perfectly over your bust. But I just wouldn't take it as far to the bust point as what I would normally. I would just make it a small, narrow, shorter dart to give you that shape and let the bias do the rest. I would definitely stay away from princess seams. If you've got a seam that's going either from the shoulder or the armhole over the bust all the way down, it's going to be really hard to sew those and make them neat, and it kind of defeats the point of using bias cut. So I wouldn't work with a princess seam pattern. I would opt to using a basic pattern. You can either draft it from scratch or work from an existing one that's got darts, and then just play around with the darts and the total width of your pattern. But a lot of this you can correct when you're fitting it as well. You can always cut quite big seams to correct it on your body. You can make a sample as well to get a really good idea, but definitely if your fabric is different for your sample to what you're actually making your garment out of, cut some big seams, because you just never know how it's going to fit differently. And you want to work out what kind of seams to use before you start as well. If you've got a really lightweight fabric, a French seam is really good. If it's slightly heavier, you could just overlock it. You need to know how much seam allowance you're going to have on your finished garment as well. So when you're cutting it out, you don't want to be folding your fabric on the bias, because it's going to be really hard to get it on the true bias when you're folding it. So what I suggest to do is, for example, if you've got a bodice piece, I would make the pattern for both sides. So just make your pattern, flip it over, have the whole thing, and then you can lay it down on your fabric. Make sure you've got your grain line on it so you know exactly which direction it's cutting. You want that arrow to go in the direction of the warp or the weft on your fabric, and that then makes your piece that you're cutting out on a 45-degree angle. So basically what I mean is, If you were working on the straight of grain, you would quite easily put your centre front on the fold. You'd fold your fabric in half and cut this out as one piece. You don't want to be doing that on the bias because you are likely to stretch it or not fold it exactly on the 45-degree angle. So all I've done is I have traced this off and then I've flipped it over and done the other side. So you're cutting it out all as one piece, and then I've drawn that straight of grain on, which I can then line up with the selvage of my fabric. If you've got a skirt piece and it's a lot wider at the bottom than it is at the top, you need to really think about exactly where you need to draw your grain line. So you need to think about the cutting out. You need to, as I said, not fold this on the bias. You're going to really struggle to get these cut out perfectly. You want all of your pieces whole. It does make for much bigger pattern pieces, and you need a bigger table or just do it on the floor, but I really wouldn't recommend folding it because you're going to struggle. So when you are cutting it out, you need to be really careful when you're pinning it and cutting it that you don't stretch it. You can weigh it down and use a rotary cutter with a mat, but obviously if you're making a dress and you've got really big pieces, unless you've got a massive mat or you're willing to cut into your floor with your rotary cutter, you're going to find that tricky. So I would suggest just pinning it and cutting it with scissors just really carefully. You don't want to be pulling it as you cut it because you're going to make all of your sides quite wavery and you could stretch it out, you could completely ruin the shape. And then just make sure once you've cut them out, when you pick them up, you don't stretch them out. You can only hang them for a second, it could really stretch it out. This is the stage where you want to do any stay stitching and stabilising. So you don't necessarily have to stay stitch down all of your seams. You want a little bit of give in those because as it stretches lengthwise, you don't want it to stretch in the middle and not at the side. You're going to end up with it all dipped. It's not going to look great. So you want to have a little bit of stretch in that seam. I'll talk more about what stitches to use in a second, but I would certainly stabilise the necks, armholes, and if you've got a zip or anything going in by doing some stay stitching around the neck and armhole, or you could use a really lightweight fusible interfacing. So when you're cutting it out, you also need to work out if your fabric stretches slightly different going in one direction to the other. If it's a basic weave, it's just a 1 over 1 under weave, it should stretch the same in both directions. But if you've got something like a satin weave, without getting too technical about how it's woven, you have floats going across. And if I've got this right, they are all quite even with a satin and they are slightly varied with a sateen. They are slightly different. 12 fabrics go over 3 and under 1 and they form a diagonal like you would see on denim. And any of those kind of fabrics, they're not going to stretch exactly the same one way as the other. It might be very subtle and you might get away with it, but just check, because if you have got satin, it could stretch a lot more in one direction to what it does in the other. So another very crude diagram to try and explain something that's not as tricky as what I'm making it sound. So basically, if you've got your skirt piece, and the same for the top, but for the skirt, you have a basic A-line shape and the same for the back. You want one facing one way and one facing the other. So if I just turn it around, that's how you look at your piece. You've got your grain line going that way. And if you look at the back, it's going the opposite direction. And the reason you want to do this is because if everything goes the same way and you've got it draping slightly more stretch on one side to the other, you could end up with the whole thing twisting, which is what you don't want. So this is just something to think about, front and back, opposite directions to stop twisting. So hopefully that makes sense, and please ask if it doesn't and I'll do a separate video completely just on that topic because it is something you really need to think about if you are using a satin. But it's probably not best for a first project anyway. I really would recommend just a basic weave, cotton or linen or a silk or something like that, but just go for a basic weave as it's going to stretch a lot more evenly. So before you start sewing, before you start constructing your garment, you need to get that stay stitching or stabilising done on your neck, any openings like that, and you also need to play around with stitches. So both going in this direction and going downwards, you want the stretch. You don't want to use a stretch stitch as such because it's quite a bulky stitch. But if you just sew a regular stitch, it's not going to have any stretch at all. So as you hang it to get that natural stretch on the sides and as you want it to mould around your body, if your seam doesn't stretch at all, you're going to not allow it to do that stretching. So what I would suggest is a really narrow zigzag stitch. So narrow that it almost looks straight, because you're not talking about a super stretchy fabric. This isn't like Lycra, it's just got a bit of natural give. So if you use a zigzag stitch, where it does, I'm exaggerating as I'm drawing it with my finger, but it allows it a little bit of movement. So if you play around on your machine and you do a zigzag stitch that's just got, it's the same length as normal, but it's just got a little bit of width from side to side. It just allows a little bit of stretch as you wear it. It can move backwards and forwards. That is the stitch that I would recommend for doing this. Just do a sample first, because you don't want your seams to look messy, but you do want them to have some give. And also have a little play around with pressing. So I'm saying pressing rather than ironing. What you don't want to do is get your iron and glide it across. It's gonna stretch out your fabric. It could stretch it in either direction. You don't want it to do either. You need to press it and just gently put it down, lift it up, put it down, lift it up along your seam. It takes a little bit longer, but it's how you're gonna get a perfect finish with this. And I would practice on seams, I would practice hems, I would practice what kind of technique you want on your hem. A rolled hem is quite good for these kind of fabrics because they're generally lightweight and soft. I have a separate video on that if you need to know how to do a rolled hem, or you could overlock it and just turn it up. You could do a rolled hem on an overlocker. There is a link above and in the description below to my hems video, which has various different hems that you could use doing bias cut, but just don't even think about doing it on the real thing until you've given it time to hang. So as you're sewing, just make sure you feed your fabric through the machine. You don't want it to stretch as it's pulled through. You need to just make sure it's naturally running through, but support your fabric as well. Support it at the front as it's going in, because if not, the weight of your fabric as it's pulling down at the front of the sewing machine might stretch that seam out. So just think about that and give it plenty of support, and just sew slowly. If you sew too fast, it could stretch it as it's just pulling it through the machine. So that's one thing to really think about. And then the last thing to think about is the edgings. And I think this is the trickiest bit, getting it right, because if you've got something going around a neck, you don't want to lose the stretch of the bias. That's the whole point of using it, but you don't want it really stretched out. You could end up with a really wiggly edge that just isn't going to look great at all. So a finish that I would recommend if you are new to this, unless you're using a cowl or something where it naturally folds under, is I would use a bias binding or a bias tape on the inside. So if you're using a binding, then it's visible on the outside, you're going to see it coming on the outside. If you're using it on the inside, then you'll just see a clean edge and then it will fold to the inside, and you can either do some top stitching with that very subtle zigzag, or you can hand sew it from the inside. But I think it's one of those things you need to play around with your fabric and decide what you want to do. And I would plan all of that out at the designing stage rather than once you start sewing, because you need to know what seam allowance to have, and you want to just make sure your design works and it's not too fiddly for your capabilities. The kind of fabric you use makes a big difference. If it's really slinky, it's going to be really tricky. If it's something like linen, it's going to be a lot easier. So just play around with all of those things before you get started, and just leave plenty of time for doing these edges at the end. Don't get it sewn together and think, wow, I'm nearly done, because you could spend a long time just getting the finishes perfect because you want it to look great. If you can get away without a zip, then that's great. You might just want a little opening, maybe in the back of the neck or at the top of the skirt or something like that with a little button. They're all things that you can think about as well when you know how much stretch you need to either get it over your head or over your hips. So I hope all of that information has given you a bit more of an insight in how to work with bias fabrics if you've never done it before. I've tried to cover everything, like the fundamental things that you need to know before you get started, and if you've never done it before, but it's always hard to think of everything. So if there's anything I've forgotten, please ask below and I will answer you. And if there's anything you're stuck with when you come to do it and you want some more information, then please let me know. I will be doing more tutorials where I actually make something, but I thought this would be a good start as I've had quite a few questions now about how to use bias and I hadn't covered any of these things. So if you've enjoyed it, please like my video, share it with anyone you know that might find it helpful, and check out my other tutorials, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any new tutorials that I'm going to be doing in the coming weeks and months.